How was Paul Orndorff and Paul Roma to work with?
Roma had a little attitude, I think. I mean, Paul was awesome. He was another guy that ended up being the booker, and so I knew Paul, for years. And I always admired him. He had a great physique, great ring presence, was just one of those guys that and Clark and I were like, former bodybuilder type guys. So when you see guys like Paul, they really paved the way for us because, or Tony Atlas and those guys, you're like, wow, like look at these guys, they look incredible. So Paul was always, I was a big fan of his and great to learn from. He was great to watch in the ring I mean, Paul Roma was good too, but and again, there's a reason why sometimes you have this attitude. You're trying to, promote yourself, a lot of self-promotion, trying to push your gimmick and your character, and I got
Right.
that. But when you come from team sports like football, it's a lot different than, all of a sudden you're kind of thrown into this self thing, and it's a little bit different than a lot of team sports. So it's a learning curve.
Right. And you can watch Paul Orndorff's matches these days. They hold up. There's
He
nothing that
he was
man couldn't
awesome.
do.
I love to watch him drop that. I took his pile driver, I think, for the finish, and I used the pile driver later. I have to tell you, and of course, it's not like you're going to make up moves anymore today, hardly. But in Japan, I did the jumping pile driver, which is Orndorff. That was his signature thing, and a lot of guys would do it, but Paul would jump up in the air with the person,
Yeah.
right? Which brought it to another level. And I remember watching that, going, "Wow! Like his pile driver looks different." And then I figured out what he was doing. He was actually jumping up. And so I said, oh, that's what he's doing. And I did that in Japan. And it was really an homage to Paul for doing the pile driver. I mean, I don't know who came up with that originally, but he definitely was kind of the signature guy for that move. And I said, oh, I'm gonna jump. So made a difference.
Yeah. I had Paul's son on, Travis. We did a tribute to him on the show, and
Oh yeah, Paul.
man,
And
one of
the
the
thing
best.
about Paul, and I knew him, as a colleague, working with him, but I didn't know him, personally, but he was just one of those stand-up guys, as was Jack Mulligan, right? Like they're almost like out of John Wayne films, they were that kind of character where if they told you something, they were going to do it or it was going to happen. And in that business, it was hard to, there was a lot of, obviously it comes from the circus background and a lot of conniving and cajoling, and I'm
Right.
going to give you this, but you're going to give me that. And when you met guys like Orndorff and Mulligan that were just like straight up, real guys, it was refreshing. And he was that
Nice.
type.
Yeah. Why did that run end?
We had a contract dispute. This is another really good story so we were signed to a developmental contract when we first got there in WCW, Clark, and rightly so. We were pretty green. But we, thought, hey, we made it to the big time. So we had some legal representation because we just thought, hey, you can't go in and negotiate an NFL contract or whatever it was without having an attorney. And they gave us a contract, and our attorney who, excuse me, we weren't paying. He was just a friend of ours, a hotshot attorney in Orlando, said, look, you guys aren't guaranteed anything. There's no, your likeness and blah, 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 and all your names. And we came up with Thunder Lightning. That was like our gimmick. We already had shirts. We came out with capes. So he said, you need to do this, this, and this. And so we came back, and the attorney wrote up all the stipulations that he had. And I think it stepped on a lot of toes, right?
Right.
Because you're like, who do these guys think they are? They're just coming into it was us and the Harlem Heat and a couple other tag teams that were really popular or, could be big, get a big push. And they, obviously we didn't know. We wouldn't have done it if we would have known, like, hey, this is not how you
Right.
negotiate here. It's a different business, right? But we did that, and they came back, and I think Bischoff and I think they probably said, "Do we need this tag team?" And again, there was a lot of tag teams, so they probably said, "Do we need this tag team?" And the answer was no, we don't. And they said, "Hey, we're going to withdraw our contract with you guys." And we were like, "Hey, wait a minute, can't we, negotiate or figure something out?" But they didn't. And so actually we were terminated after about 2 years on a developmental contract. And it was tough because I ended up doing more independence. Clark went into a family business that he had. He was married and had to support his family, and so he ended up doing that. And I was not going to even pursue pro wrestling after this. Really, I was going into teaching. I was a substitute teaching at the time. And then also I had American Gladiators, another sidetrack. The American Gladiators, if you remember that show, they
Sure.
wanted me to maybe do that, and so I was thinking about doing that, and I ended up getting back into the business really. So, as a single wrestler, which I had not really had that much experience as, and ended up getting back in WCW.
Before though, did you ever try out with WWF?
I one time when after New Japan when I was working there, and it just wasn't. I think they tried to change the finish at the end, and it was like I think that it was just not. And I knew a lot of those guys. I knew Finley and Malenko and all those guys pretty well. But it just some kind of it really didn't work, and I didn't really pursue it after that. I was thinking about at that time retiring anyway. Just wasn't really going to keep going.
This was after Japan. I thought it
Yeah,
was.
it was after Japan, after New
Uh,
Japan.
I thought it was in between Thunder and Lightning and Cobra. No.
No, I didn't. I never
Oh,
tried out with them at that point.
okay. How'd you end up going back to WCW?
I was in Atlanta, living there, married or had gotten married, and wasn't sure what I was going to do. And I think Dallas Page, I bumped into Dallas Page or somebody at the gym, and he's like, "Hey, you need to come down. You're a good wrestler. You should do a single." And so I went back down to the power plant, and just started working a little more, and came up with the Cobra character. And I think this is at the time Flair had the book, so I don't know. It was a weird time, and I think if Rick was the interim, booker at that time. We were working center stage a lot in downtown there. And he said, yeah, he said, I know you know how to work. He said, yeah, come see me. And so I started doing kind of Cobra, but it wasn't a full contract. It was just basically come down, work, and I was just trying to get back into the door, basically, get my feet back into pro wrestling. And that's when I started Cobra. And then from Cobra is when I did the NWO Sting, is when they said, hey, if you'll do this, we'll get you on contract. And that's kind of where I made that transition.
Okay, so let's go. Let's go there. Who
Well,
approaches
I
you?
mean, I mean Cobra, and I like Cobra, but I wasn't being used, the way, of course, you think you should be, and you're like, why
Right.
am I, not getting any kind of real push? But and I've said this before, like at the time, there was a lot of good talent in WCW, and what you had was this kind of talent that was not over because they had never been like a chance to really develop on TV. But you had all of
Right.
these veteran guys like Hacksaw Jim Duggan and other guys that were over and everybody recognized. And so, you have new talent that doesn't really is not really getting a chance, and these other guys. So of course, and they're paying them more to be there. So they're gonna not, you're not gonna get over, right?